Welcome to the HaaseTank installation DVD for the T400. The first step is to prepare the site for the tank. Make sure that the area is clean and free of clutter. The next step is to prepare the 2 layers of insulation for the base of the tank. First, place the larger top of the outer tank shell onto the insulation and trace a circle. Using a serrated handsaw, cut out the circle you traced. Use the leftover insulation to trace and cut a circle using the smaller top of the inner tank. Apply the adhesive tape to the seams of both circles. Position the insulation base so that there is enough space to walk completely around the tank. Measure and mark the inner base insulation to be certain that it is centered over the bottom insulation. Write down the component number of the base on the schema sheet. Place the tank base onto the insulation base. Now it's time to uncrate the heat exchanger, which is wrapped with the inner and outer shells of the tank. Write down the component number on the schema sheet. The core and shell are dollied into the basement and lifted onto the tank base. A safety note: when you cut the top straps, the heat exchanger tubes are bent and will fly upwards. Make sure you are standing to the side of the core when you cut these straps. A winch and strap are then tightened around the core before the remaining straps are cut, and the winch is slowly loosened around the tank shell. Next, the heat exchanger is centered on the base using a tape measure. This ends phase 1 of the installation. The tools you'll need for riveting the tank are as follows: the cincher for closing the shell, a drill with a 4.1 mm bit, and a special bit for the outer shell, a riveting gun, and 2 types of rivets: the long stainless steel rivets for the tank, and shorter aluminum rivets for the outer tank shell. The next step is to prepare the tank for riveting. Position the tank seam directly under the exchanger pipes. Write down the component number of the lid, insert the filling pipe into the lid, and place the lid on top of the tank. A notch on the lid allows you to quickly align it with the top of the heat exchanger. Insert the 4 temperature sensor tubes by placing them through the tank window, and then push them to the bottom of the tank. Tighten the shell seam against the base using the cincher until there is a small bulge above the cincher. Walk around the entire tank base to make sure that the shell is sitting tightly on the bottom of the base. Now it's time to drill the first hole for the rivets. The first hole is drilled 2 inches above the rim of the tank base using a 4.1 mm drill. Never pre-drill all the rivet holes at once. Drill each hole one at a time to make sure that the seam is tight, and always use the long stainless steel rivets on the tank, never the aluminum rivets, which are for the outer shell. Cinch the top seam the same as the bottom. Check the lid seam around the entire tank, and then begin drilling and riveting from the bottom up, spacing the rivets 4 inches apart. When you get within a few inches of the cincher, remove it and finish riveting. Now it's time to install the connection plate. Center the plate in the window. The top of the internal overflow pipe should be about 2 inches from the top of the tank. Now it's time to take a measurement for the water gauge drill holes on the tank's outer shell. This measurement is very important. From the top of the copper overflow pipe on the outside of the connection plate, measure 8.2 inches above the pipe and make a mark on the tank. Now, take a measurement from the floor to the mark you just made and write it down. You'll need this measurement later when you drill holes for the water gauge in the outer shell. When you begin drilling and riveting the connection plate, begin at any corner and rivet the side seam, spacing the rivets 2 inches apart. Once you have a side complete, alternate your riveting between the top and bottom seams until you're finished. Now it's time to rivet the lid to the heat core. Drill and place your rivets directly across the seam from the 6 rivets of the heat core. Tape the seam with overlapping 2-inch strips to prevent wet resin from seeping into the tank. The final step before we begin phase 3 is to make sure the tank seams are clean and ready for the fiberglass. Use a fine grade sandpaper to remove any dirt or debris near the tank seams. The next step is to prepare the epoxy and fiberglass. Make sure that the room you're working in is well ventilated by opening any windows and by using fans or blowers to keep the fumes from the epoxy and fiberglass to a minimum. The tools and process are very simple. The small bowl is for mixing the paste with the accelerator, and the large bowl is for the resin. The wooden stick is for stirring the resin. The spreader is for applying the epoxy to the tank, the white roller is for applying resin to the fiberglass, and the metal roller is used to apply the fiberglass to the tank. The tall beaker is for measuring the accelerator, and the larger measuring cup is for the resin. Standard acetone is used to clean the tools. Before you prepare the epoxy, tear the fiberglass into equal length strips of approximately 12 to 14 inches. Now it's time to mix the epoxy and accelerator in the small bowl. Use 1 pound of epoxy with 0.1 ounces of accelerator and mix them together thoroughly for 1 minute. Now it's time for the resin. Pour 2 cupfuls, 17 ounces, into the large bowl. Now we're ready to begin applying the epoxy and the fiberglass to the tank. Start on top of the tank. The epoxy is applied generously along the seam of the tank's lid over the tape and is then smoothed with the spreader. Next, the fiberglass strips are drenched one at a time with the resin. For the top of the tank, 3 fiberglass strips are placed together and applied to the seam of the tank with the metal roller. The fiberglass strips are overlapped approximately 2 inches to make sure there are no gaps. Make sure to roll out all the air bubbles thoroughly, moving the roller in multiple directions across the fiberglass. Apply the fiberglass directly after applying the paste. If you wait more than a few minutes to apply the fiberglass, the epoxy will harden. Work in sections, completing the fiberglassing of each section of the tank before moving on to the next. Create an assembly line with one person applying resin to the fiberglass strips, while the other person applies the epoxy and wet fiberglass to the tank. Once the lid is finished, apply the epoxy in sections to all of the tank's outer seams, beginning at the top and working your way down. Use enough epoxy to fill the gaps in the seams and leaving approximately a 1/16 inch layer over the seam and the rivets. Be sure to force the epoxy into the seams with the spreader. Add an extra dab over each rivet and smooth. Now we're ready to apply fiberglass to the sides of the tank. It's crucial to remember that the procedure for layering the fiberglass on the sides of the tank is different than it is for the tank lid. For the sides of the tank, the fiberglass will be applied in a single layer first and then a double layer immediately afterwards. Here, 2 strips are applied side by side as the first layer. overlapping their edges 2 inches and thoroughly rolled. If the fiberglass isn't wet enough, add some more resin with the roller. Be careful not to apply excessive pressure with the metal roller when applying the first layer, or you'll risk squeezing epoxy out of the seam. Next, a double layer is applied immediately over the top of the single layer and rolled thoroughly. The same procedure is followed for the remainder of the tank and the connection plate. Once the tank is finished, the fiberglass needs to dry for a minimum of 1 hour and may require longer drying time in cold or damp environments. After the fiberglass has dried, we'll begin the fourth and final phase of the installation. In the fourth and final stage of the installation, the tank is prepped, wrapped in insulation, tubes and hardware are attached, and the outer shell is assembled. First, the top edge is trimmed with a utility knife to smooth the edge. The tank is measured and centered. Next, the insulation will be wrapped around the tank and taped. Begin at the bottom and work toward the top, applying tape at the seams of the insulation to hold it in place. Now it's time to attach the red overflow hose to the copper overflow pipe and secure it with a clamp. Thread the tube behind the insulation and out through the seam. Next, the silicone tube for the water level indicator is attached and secured with a clamp. Don't forget to slide the anti-kinking sleeve onto the tube. Cut an opening in the insulation, thread the water gauge tube through, and tape the insulation together. Now it's time to insulate the top of the tank. Cover the entire top of the tank with insulation. Tear thinner pieces of insulation and be certain to insulate both underneath and on top of the exchanger pipes. Once the insulation is finished, it's time to install the tank's outer shell and complete all the tank connections. First, a mark is made centrally just under the bottom of the slots where a hole will be drilled for the fill pipe. The hole is drilled and the fill pipe threaded through the hole. The exchanger pipes are secured in their slots and the pipe brace inserted. Next, the outer shell is measured and marked for drilling. The hole for the red overflow hose is marked 5.5 inches from the edge of the shell. Next, the holes for the water gauge are marked. For the top hole, use the measurement you wrote down earlier when installing the connection plate. The holes are drilled. The water gauge is attached. Be sure to tighten the gauge from the front and back. The water gauge tube is cut and clamped to the gauge valve. The overflow pipe is inserted, the tube cut to length, and attached with a clamp. The shell is now ready to be secured and riveted. Place the lid on the tank. Use the wincher at the base of the shell to compress it snugly around the insulation. Take a measurement of the overlap in the shell seam so that you have the same overlap on the top seam of the shell. Drill and rivet the bottom hole 2 inches from the bottom before releasing the winch. Make sure to use the shorter aluminum rivets for the outer shell. Then make a mark every 6 inches along the seam for the rivets. Drill and rivet the entire shell seam one hole at a time. Use a 2x4 or other strong straight edge to create a tight seam as you drill and rivet. Do not rivet the lid. Repeat, do not rivet the lid. Now it's time for the finishing touches. Apply the decals. Attach the appropriate tags to the exchanger pipes. Be careful to match the correct tags with the correct pipes. Attach the filler valve and tighten. Then hang the washers in their bag for the exchanger pipes. Attach the schema and document bag and the installation is complete. Congratulations! You have just installed your first Haase T400 tank. The average installation time for the tank is approximately 4 to 5 hours depending on the size of the tank. Thank you and good luck on your future installations. This has been a Haase training DVD. Thank you for joining us.